I think this is true. They don't actually look like the dead. They look like visitors from another planet. As you begin the process of dissection, you enter, literally and mentally and imaginatively, into the bodies of these dead men and women. I mean, as you separate nerves and blood vessels and dissect muscles away from the bones, you are getting as close to another human being in the physical sense, and to some extent the imaginative sense, you can ever do. And I think it's an enriching and powerful experience.
Dissection is a kind of erotic autopsy. I imagine the strange act of love performed by an obsessed surgeon on a living woman in a deserted operating theatre in one of those sinister clinics in the Cambridge suburbs. I would kiss the linings of her lungs, run my tongue along her bronchi, press my face to the moist membranes of her heart as it pulsed against my lips.
It seemed to me that by dissecting the body, by understanding how all its various biological systems function, you were getting to some sort of basic truth about human beings. Of course, the brain lay beyond, but at least it was a start. And so particularly as the human body was surrounded with so many taboos, and still is, and of course in 1951 was surrounded by infinitely more taboos than it is now, it seemed to be a start. But after 2 years I'd had enough, and I still hadn't found myself in England, which seemed to me a very, very strange place. So for a few years I embarked on a kind of catch-as-catch-can existence, working for an advertising agency for a brief while. I went to Canada with the RAF as a trainee pilot for a while. I left after about 7 or 8 months and decided I'd had enough of the Air Force. Flying had been interesting, and it had given me another set of myths to live by, all of which, oddly enough, I fed into my fiction. Flying has always been a very important part of my fiction. I think it stems from my childhood, and in particular the air war over Shanghai. I think this first sight of the American B-29s began to bomb Shanghai in 1944. And then the fighter attacks by Mustangs that flew so low over Long Camp that I remember looking down at them from the second and third floor of buildings during the air raids. I mean, they were flying within 10 feet of the paddy fields. I mean, I accept the sort of idea that flight is a sort of symbol of escape, but I think more than escape, of transcendence. And it's played a very large role in my fiction. My characters are forever dreaming of runways and looking into those skies where they can transcend themselves, and from which, of course, in the mid and late 20th century, life and death come in terms of nuclear weapons. I think I was assembling a kind of mythology for myself, a kind of substitute. I'd deliberately forgotten my China background by then. I never mentioned it to anybody. My wife, when I married her in 1954 or 55, I don't think I ever told her that I was born and brought up in Shanghai, or if I did, it was only in passing, and I hardly ever described it to my children.
The past had slipped away, taking with it my memories of Cambridge, of the dissecting room, and even Shanghai. The warm light over Shepperton reminded me of the illuminated air that I'd seen over the empty paddy fields of Longhua as I walked along the railway line. But the light that filled the splash meadow came from a kinder and more gentle sun. The children who played by the stream had taken the place of the dead Chinese lying in the Longhua creeks and canals. For the first time, I was living in an endless present that owed nothing to the past.
We came here, my wife and I, in 1960. We had 3 very young children, and we were looking for a house where we could bring them up, really, in a sort of quiet suburb. So we saw that a house was advertised here and had a look around Shepperton and found that in many ways it was a sort of tranquil and quite mysterious place. The river, which winds through Shepperton like a sort of great snake. All the gravel lakes here and the great reservoirs of the Metropolitan Water Board together make... You realize when you fly from Heathrow and look down on the place that this is a marine world. And I think it was a right choice at the time because Shepperton has sort of insinuated itself into my fiction over the years.
I'd arrived in Vermilion Sands 3 months earlier. Driving into the desert one day, I stopped near the coral towers on the highway to Lagoon West. As I gazed at these immense pagodas stranded on the floor of this fossil sea, I heard music coming from a sand reef 200 yards away, where sonic statues had run to seed beside a ruined studio. The owner had gone, abandoning the hangar-like building to the sand rays and the desert.
When I started reading science fiction for the first time in 1954, and I was unusual in that I started writing it at almost the same time. Science fiction, I think, was dominated by its sociological speculation. It was really interested in the present rather than the very far future. And it struck me that science fiction had the right vocabulary with which to explore the world in which we found ourselves living in the mid-1950s. It seemed to me that a new kind of Britain was emerging. The first motorways, and above all, I think, the TV landscape that was being imposed on all this. I mean, all the great issues of the day at that time, the threat of nuclear war, the development of modern communication systems, in particular television, the role that computers were going to play, the transformation of the whole planet into a media landscape, the changing nature of fiction and reality within that media landscape. All these were topics that were not covered in any way by, say, the English mainstream novel of the day.
This is Radio Moscow.
It struck me that here was an interesting field that was ripe for takeover, I felt.
The first artificial Earth satellite in the world.
In this overlit realm ruled by images of the space race and the Vietnam War, the Kennedy assassination and the suicide of Marilyn Monroe, a unique alchemy of the imagination was taking place. The brutalizing newsreels of civil wars and assassinations, the stylization of televised violence into an anthology of design statements, were matched by a pornography of science that took its materials not from nature, but from the deviant curiosity of the scientist.
Across Asia, Africa, and South America, controlling the pitch and roll of the ship.
After I got married, children began to appear. I needed some kind of much more settled life so that I could write in the evenings and at weekends. So I took a job on a chemical society journal called Chemistry and Industry, which was a weekly scientific journal. I was assistant editor of it. It was a good place to work because, of course, the office of any scientific magazine is the most wonderful mail drop. It's the ultimate sort of information crossroads. Most of it went straight into the waste paper basket, but en route, I was sort of filtering it like some sort of sea creature sailing with its jaws open through a great sea of delicious plankton. I was filtering all this extraordinary material. I certainly remember reading with great interest the first